Melissa leaned against the kitchen counter, watching the first rays of sunlight slide through the large windows of her home. The morning promised to be as ordinary as all the previous ones. Her house, cozy and slightly old-fashioned, was located on a quiet street in a small town in Wisconsin. This silence used to soothe her, but now it had become unbearable. Over the years, loneliness had ceased to be a choice, turning into a burdensome inevitability. Melissa's gaze fell on the old coffee maker that had recently stopped working. She decided that today was the day to get rid of it. Trying to suppress the feeling of emptiness, she threw a light cardigan over her blouse, gathered her hair into a low bun, and headed to the nearest appliance store. The Techno Comfort store, located in the city center, greeted her with bright signs and slightly intrusive background music. Upon entering, Melissa immediately felt her attention drawn to the young man behind the counter. His easy, relaxed smile stood out amidst the store's bustle. He looked no older than 25, and his slightly tousled chestnut hair and confident demeanor made him almost irresistible. It was Liam. "Good morning. How can I help you?" he asked, smiling friendly as she approached. Melissa instantly felt uncomfortable. She was not used to such attention, especially from young men. His manner of speaking was both confident and approachable. She pointed to the coffee maker section and explained that she was looking for a reliable model, without going into details about her old machine. Liam nodded and began showing different options. He was clearly a professional. His explanations were clear, and his humor was appropriate. He spoke with an ease that helped Melissa relax a bit. They discussed the pros and cons of different models until she settled on one. "Would you like home delivery?" Liam suddenly offered. "It will take less time than if you have to deal with the box yourself." Melissa thought about it. It was an unexpected offer, but there was a sincere desire to help in his eyes. She didn't want to seem rude, and besides, the prospect of returning to an empty house with a heavy box didn't seem appealing. "I think that would be convenient," she replied with a slight smile. Liam quickly processed the purchase and said he could deliver the coffee maker within an hour. When Melissa returned home, she suddenly felt a slight excitement. She couldn't quite understand why she had so easily agreed to let an almost stranger into her home. She surveyed the living room to make sure everything was in place, but her gaze lingered on the sofa. There lay things she hadn't put away for a long time. A soft blanket, a couple of books, and several personal items that could embarrass any guest. She had a fleeting thought to hide them, but the doorbell interrupted her thoughts. At the door stood Liam with a wide box in his hands. His face was lit up with a smile that calmed Melissa, despite her inner tension. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and, glancing around the room, headed to the kitchen. "You have a cozy home," he said, placing the box on the table. "Do you live alone?" Melissa felt the blood rush to her cheeks. The question was asked so casually that there was no hint of judgment in his voice, but she felt embarrassed at how intently he was looking around the room. She noticed how his gaze lingered on the sofa, and at that moment she felt a sharp sense of vulnerability. "Yes, alone," she replied, trying to sound confident. "It's my little corner of peace." Liam nodded, smiled, and began unpacking the coffee maker. His movements were confident and quick, but his gaze kept returning to Melissa, as if he was trying to unravel some secret of hers. The atmosphere in the room began to change. She felt a growing, invisible tension between them. "Sometimes loneliness is good," he said suddenly, setting up the machine. "But sometimes it becomes too loud." These words echoed in her head. She didn't know how to respond, so she silently watched him finish the job. Her thoughts raced between feelings of embarrassment and a strange, unfamiliar interest in this young man. When the work was done, Liam turned to her and said, "Everything is ready. If you have any questions or problems, just call the store, and I will definitely help." Melissa thanked him, but there was more warmth in her voice than she expected. Liam, lingering his gaze on her a little longer than necessary, finally opened the door to leave. "Have a good day, Melissa," he said with a slight smile. When the door closed, she stood in silence. Her heart was beating faster than usual. She tried to understand what had excited her so much. His words, his smile, or the unexpected feeling that something new and unexplored had entered her life. The chapter ends with Melissa sitting on the couch, looking at the coffee maker, and catching herself thinking that for the first time in a long time, her loneliness feels a little different. Melissa woke up the next day with a slight feeling of anxiety. The night had been restless. She kept seeing fragments of the previous day's events. She saw Liam's face, his smile, heard his voice. It was strange because she was used to dealing with loneliness, pushing away such thoughts. But now something had changed. In the kitchen stood the new coffee maker, shining with its gleam. It reminded her that her life, if only for one evening, had intersected with someone else's. Sighing, Melissa brewed herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. Her gaze wandered around the room until she noticed the items left on the sofa that had caught Liam's attention the day before. Her cheeks flushed with memories. Melissa had never allowed herself to take such things seriously. They were just a way to distract herself from loneliness. But yesterday, at the moment when Liam noticed them, she felt vulnerable, as if her carefully guarded privacy had been invaded. A few days later, Melissa decided to return to the Techno Comfort store. She needed a new filter for the coffee maker, and although she could have ordered it online, she felt the urge to go there in person. She didn't admit it to herself, but she hoped to see Liam again. Entering the store, she noticed him behind the counter. Liam immediately recognized her and approached with a smile. "Melissa, nice to see you. How's the coffee maker working? Everything okay?" he asked warmly. She nodded, feeling her voice tremble slightly. "Yes, everything is fine. Thank you for your help. I just thought I should buy a spare filter, just in case." Liam led her to the shelf with filters. His behavior was as easy as the first time, but now there was something new between them. When they stopped at the right shelf, he turned to her. "You know, I've been thinking about you, about how you live alone in such a cozy house. It must be interesting." "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. "Well, not everyone likes loneliness. I think you have your own way of dealing with it." He smiled slightly, but there was a glint of curiosity in his eyes. Melissa felt her heart quicken. Liam's words were simple, but there was an undertone to them. She suddenly remembered how he had looked at her things in the living room, how his gaze had lingered on the sofa. "Liam, why does this interest you?" Her voice was soft, but there was a note of wariness in it. He took a step back, showing that he didn't want to pressure her. "I didn't mean to offend you. It's just that sometimes when you meet people, you feel that they have a story you want to know." These words pierced her. He seemed to see what she had hidden from others for so long. Melissa had always avoided talking too much about herself, especially with people she barely knew. But Liam was different. His attention didn't feel like an intrusion. It was more like an invitation to open up a part of herself. When Melissa returned home, she sat on the sofa for a long time, holding the purchased filter in her hands. Her thoughts were jumbled. She felt drawn to Liam, even though she tried to deny it. What could he see in a woman almost 3 decades older than him? Why had he so easily awakened emotions in her that she had long forgotten? These questions wouldn't leave her alone. She looked at the coffee maker again as if she could find answers in its shine. But instead, her thoughts kept returning to how Liam had looked at her, how his voice had penetrated her thoughts. She knew that the next step could change a lot, and despite the fear, a small flame of hope burned within her. Melissa sat in her kitchen, watching the sunlight fall on the polished surface of the new coffee maker. The room was filled with an almost eerie silence. She was alone as always, but now her loneliness felt different. Thoughts of Liam wouldn't leave her. His voice, his way of speaking, his gaze, everything had left an indelible impression. She tried to focus on her tasks, but the day dragged on slowly. And when the phone rang, her heart skipped a beat. She rarely received calls, so when she heard an unfamiliar number, she answered with a slight wariness. "Hi, Melissa. It's Liam." His voice sounded warm and casual. Melissa was speechless for a moment. She hadn't expected him to call. "Liam?" Hi, how are you? Her voice came out a little higher than she intended. Great, thanks. I thought it would be nice to check if everything is okay with the coffee maker, and maybe you want to meet? Just to have coffee and chat. These words caught her off guard. Melissa hesitated, but deep down, she knew she wanted to agree. I think that's a good idea, she replied, trying to sound confident. Liam suggested meeting at a small coffee shop not far from the city center. Her heart was pounding as she got ready. Light makeup, an elegant dress that accentuated her figure but didn't look ostentatious. She hadn't felt this excited in a long time. When she entered the coffee shop, Liam was already waiting for her. He was sitting by the window, his face lit by the soft light. Seeing her, he smiled and stood up to greet her. You look beautiful, Melissa, he said, pulling out a chair for her. She blushed slightly but responded with a smile. Thank you. You too. Their conversation started with familiar topics: coffee, work, weather. But gradually, Liam began to ask more personal questions. His interest was genuine but cautious. Tell me about yourself, he said, leaning in slightly. How did you end up here in this town? Melissa thought about it. Her story was simple and complex at the same time. Divorce, moving, trying to find herself. She told him about it honestly, though she tried to avoid too much emotion. Liam listened attentively, not interrupting, and occasionally asked clarifying questions. And you? Why are you here? She asked in return. Liam paused for a moment before answering. I grew up in this town. After college, I decided to stay, even though all my friends moved away. Sometimes I think I made the wrong choice. I feel empty. These words struck a chord with Melissa. She felt that Liam was talking about something deep, even if he was expressing himself cautiously. I understand you, she said softly. Emptiness. It can be as much a home as the walls around us. They exchanged glances, and at that moment, something intangible but palpable passed between them. It wasn't just attraction. It was understanding. After coffee, they decided to take a little walk. A small alley with blooming trees and soft evening light became the perfect backdrop for their conversation. Liam told stories from his childhood, funny and touching, making her laugh. She felt light, almost as if the years of loneliness had disappeared. You're amazing, he said suddenly, stopping and looking her straight in the eyes. His words were simple, but they carried genuine sincerity. Melissa wanted to respond, but a lump in her throat prevented her. She just smiled, and he, as if understanding her silence, gently took her hand. This gesture was unexpected but natural. They stood under the trees, and everything around them seemed to freeze. For Melissa, this moment was like a breath of fresh air. She allowed herself to forget about age, the difference in experience and fears. For the first time in a long time, she felt alive. When they approached her house, Liam stopped at the gate. Thanks for the evening, Melissa, he said, slightly squeezing her hand. It was incredible. I should be thanking you, Liam, she replied, feeling her heart quicken again. They exchanged glances, and for a moment, Melissa thought he might lean in to kiss her. But instead, Liam just smiled, let go of her hand, and walked away, leaving her standing at the gate. Melissa watched him go for a long time. She felt that something had changed that evening. The spark that had ignited between them was more than just attraction. It was the beginning of something real, even if it was scary. Melissa sat in her living room, running her fingers along the edges of the blanket on her lap. Outside the window, dusk was gathering, enveloping her house in a soft orange light. Thinking about Liam had become her habit over the past few days. Memories of that evening, his words, his touch, his smile, wouldn't leave her. She knew there was a connection between them, but how far could it go? Her phone vibrated on the table. A message from Liam. Hi, Melissa. I was thinking, maybe you wouldn't mind if I stopped by. Just want to talk. Promise it won't be long. Melissa's heart skipped a beat, and then it started beating faster. She looked at the screen, hesitating, but an inner voice told her she should agree. Her fingers quickly typed a reply. Of course. I'm home. Come over. Liam arrived 20 minutes later. She heard his car pull up, and soon he was at the door, a little excited but with the same gentle smile. He was dressed simply, dark jeans and a light jacket. This look only emphasized his casualness. Hope I'm not interrupting your plans? He asked, coming inside. No, of course not, she replied, trying to hide her excitement. I was just relaxing. Liam took off his jacket and glanced around her living room. It was cozy but reminded her of the past, like a museum of memories. He smiled, noticing the details. The vintage record player, the bookshelf, the knitted blankets. You have it so peaceful here, he noted, walking into the room. But sometimes the silence can be too loud, right? His words seemed to lay her soul bare. She didn't know what to say, so she just gestured for him to sit down. They settled on the sofa, facing each other. There was a slight awkwardness between them. You know, Liam began, a little embarrassed. I've been thinking about our evening. It was unusual. I felt like I could be myself with you, without pretense, without games. Melissa looked at him, feeling her heart constrict at his words. I felt at ease with you too, Liam. It's rare. Especially... Now... Her voice trembled slightly, but she tried to speak confidently. He looked at her as if trying to read her thoughts. Then, gathering his courage, he moved closer. Melissa, I know this is strange, he said, looking her straight in the eyes. You're older than me. We have different lives, but I feel something real. You make me want to be better. And I don't want to ignore this. She was silent. His words touched her deeply, but at the same time, she felt a rising fear. What was the point of starting something that was doomed to criticism and perhaps pain? Liam, you're kind, sincere, but you have to understand. The age difference is more than just numbers. People will talk. You might regret this, she said, trying to sound firm, even though her voice betrayed her inner struggle. I don't care what others say, he replied confidently. What matters to me is what you think. If you say it doesn't matter, I'll go. But if even a part of you feels the same way I do, I'm asking. Give us a chance. These words struck her. She understood that she was now at a crossroads. Melissa slowly reached for his hand, placing her fingers on his. It was a barely perceptible gesture, but it said more than words. I don't know where this will lead, Liam, she said softly. But I don't want to regret not trying. His face lit up with a smile. He took her hand in his, squeezing it slightly, and then, suddenly, leaned in towards her. Their faces were so close that she could feel his breath. At that moment, the world around them disappeared. When their lips met, it was a soft, almost tentative kiss, but it carried all the depth of emotions they had been hiding. The evening continued. They talked, laughed, and shared stories they had never told anyone else. Liam was there with her, his gaze filled with sincerity. For Melissa, this moment was something new, strange, but wonderfully right. When Liam finally left, she remained sitting on the sofa, looking out the window. There was warmth in her heart, but deep down there was also a fear of the future. She knew this was the beginning of a journey that would be difficult, but at the same time she felt ready to take the risk. The spark that had ignited between them was too bright to ignore. The morning was overcast, with rain softly tapping against the windows, creating a cozy yet slightly melancholic atmosphere in Melissa's home. She sat in her kitchen with a freshly brewed cup of coffee, her eyes fixed on the phone screen. Liam's message from the previous evening still hung there, unread. Thanks for last night, Melissa. It was one of the most unusual and beautiful evenings of my life. Hope you feel the same. Let's talk when you have time. Her fingers trembled as she swiped across the screen, rereading the words again and again. She wanted to reply, to say that she felt the same, but something held her back. The age difference, experience, fear, it all seemed to create a barrier between her heart and mind. She didn't reply. The day passed in tense silence. Melissa tried to distract herself with household chores, but thoughts of Liam wouldn't leave her. She remembered his face, his smile, his voice. It was strange because she had learned to deal with loneliness, pushing away such thoughts. But now something had changed. In the evening, there was a knock at the door. She froze, not expecting visitors. With a slight tremble, she opened the door and saw Liam. He stood in the rain, his hair damp, his face serious, almost tense. "Hi," he said, a bit embarrassed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Sorry to show up unannounced. You didn't reply, and I just had to see you." Melissa took a deep breath, not knowing what to say. She gestured for him to come in. He took off his wet jacket and sat in the living room. The silence between them was heavy, almost palpable. "I was waiting for you to reply," he began, looking her straight in the eyes. "But I guess I scared you. Or did you change your mind?" She lowered her gaze, feeling the pressure in her chest. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Liam, I don't know what to do. It's all so sudden. I'm afraid of hurting you. Afraid that one day you'll realize it was a mistake." He leaned in closer, his gaze softening but firm. "It's not a mistake for me." "You know what is a mistake? Hiding from what you feel. You might be afraid for me, but I'm an adult, Melissa. I made this choice myself." "And you? What do you choose?" Her heart was racing. She understood that his words were not just sincere. They were a challenge to her own fears. She looked at him, feeling a mix of conflicting emotions. "Liam, it's not that simple. I'm older than you. People will talk. You deserve someone younger, more suitable for you." "Who decides that?" he interrupted. "People? Other people's opinions? I don't care what others say. I want to be with you. Doesn't that matter?" These words made her fall silent. She realized that she had been hiding behind her fears and excuses to avoid the risk. But this risk was real, alive. It was sitting right in front of her. They spent a long evening talking. Liam shared stories about his life, about how he often felt lonely despite his youth and surroundings. Melissa, in turn, shared her experiences. The pain of divorce, the fear that she would never feel needed again. Each exchange of words was a step towards each other. "You know what I'm most afraid of?" she finally admitted. "That one day you'll leave, and I'll have to pick up the pieces again." Liam took her hand, squeezing her fingers. "I can't promise it will be perfect," he said gently. "But I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure you don't feel alone. And I'll never leave just like that. Only if you ask me to." These words were a turning point for her. She looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes that she had longed for. Inside her, doubts still lingered, but they were being pushed aside by a desire to try. Later, when he left, Melissa stood by the window for a long time, watching his car disappear into the rainy darkness. At that moment, she understood that she couldn't forget his words, his confidence. She had to take the risk, even if it meant breaking down all the barriers she had built around herself. The morning began with soft sunlight filtering through the thick curtains of Melissa's bedroom. She woke up with a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. Calm mixed with a slight tremor. The night had been restless. Thoughts of Liam, his words, his gaze. Everything had left an indelible mark. She got up, put on a light robe, and headed to the kitchen. The sound of the coffee maker humming on the table was like a symbol of her new decisions. This appliance seemed to be the link between her old life and what was beginning now. Later that day, Liam suggested they meet. This time, she agreed without hesitation. They decided to take a walk in the park near her house. Melissa stood on the sidewalk, watching as he got out of his car and walked towards her. He looked fresh and confident, but she noticed a slight nervousness in his eyes. "Are you okay?" she asked as he approached. I am now. He replied with a soft smile. I was just nervous that you might change your mind. She looked at him and her heart ached. He was so young, full of energy, and yet there was a maturity in him that made her feel comfortable. They began their walk along a narrow path surrounded by tall trees. The wind gently rustled their hair and the leaves crunched softly under their feet. Their conversation was light and easy, as if the tense dialogue from the previous evening had been forgotten. You know, Liam began, glancing at her sideways, I've been thinking about how strangely life turns out. Who would have thought I'd meet you in an appliance store? If I had known that coffee maker would lead me here, I would have bought it much earlier. Melissa laughed. His lightness and humor always helped her relax. If someone had told me a month ago that I'd be walking with someone as young as you, I would never have believed it. She replied, smiling. You say that like I'm a teenager, he teased. I'm 24. I'm an adult. It's not just about age, Liam. It's about experience. She noted seriously. Sometimes it feels like we're from different worlds. He stopped and looked at her intently. Melissa, you said the key word. Feels. But you and I are here now, and that's not just a coincidence. We might be from different worlds, but they've intersected, and I don't want to miss this chance. She fell silent, looking into his eyes. His confidence made her feel that she could allow herself to take the risk. The evening ended at her house. They sat on the sofa, sipping wine and listening to soft music. It was a moment of peace when words were not needed. Liam sat next to her, his arm resting on the back of the sofa, barely touching her shoulder. She felt the warmth of his presence, which filled the house with life. Have you ever thought about what our life together would look like? She asked, not looking up. Sometimes, he replied. But I try not to think too far ahead. I want to live in the present. And you? She thought for a moment before answering. I'm afraid to plan. I like this moment, but the future always seems so uncertain. Then let's make a deal, he said, taking her hand. We'll live one day at a time. No unnecessary expectations and fears. Just you and me. She nodded, and her smile was full of gratitude. This young man had taught her to see the world differently, to be braver, even when fears tried to take over. At that moment, she decided she would no longer run away. Weeks turned into months, and their life was not perfect. There were moments when Melissa had doubts, and Liam faced misunderstandings from friends. But they learned to deal with it together. Each day they discovered something new about each other, building their world where the age difference and others' opinions didn't matter. Their story was just beginning. But Melissa already knew. It had been the right decision. She felt alive again, needed, loved. And that was more important than any fear. Looking at Liam, who was now preparing dinner in her kitchen, she understood that he had become her home. Not the walls, not the things, but him. His confidence, kindness, love. And for the first time in a long time, she was happy, just living in the moment.